The corridor smelled of antiseptic and coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed a steady, indifferent note above a line of plastic chairs. A drip of air from the vents whispered like a small, patient clock. He held his daughter's hand the way you hold a fragile bird, fingers curled, careful not to squeeze, not quite letting go. "Daddy, am I getting worse?" The question was a thin thing, a thread pulled from somewhere deep and frayed. It landed on him as if thrown through a window. For a moment, the hallway narrowed to the length of that sentence. He felt every weight he carried collect in his chest. The months of late nights, the stack of bills folded into a single envelope, the 2 words he had not said aloud in a year, the name he kept quiet in his throat because saying it made the past real. He looked down. Her eyes were small and serious, ringed with the kind of trust children give only rarely, the faith that adults will know what to do. Her hand was small, calloused at the knuckles where she clutched the corner of a folded drawing like it was all the armor she owned. Around her neck on a thin chain swung a little metal charm engraved with one word, brave. It had been his wife's idea, a small thing they'd bought in a Rush Hospital gift shop the night after the diagnosis. Whatever they were calling it then, a word they never placed next to her name. He remembered how his wife had tilted her head and said, "We'll have to wear brave for a while." He had laughed and then cried, and kept the laugh because he did not want the children to see both. The child's voice again, quieter, as if the question could pierce the fluorescent light itself. "Daddy?" He swallowed. The sound he made was small. It was not a sentence. He wanted to lie. He wanted to promise her something that would stop the rent notices from coming, or convince the doctor that the uncertainty would be kind. He wanted to fold himself into something larger and carry the night away. But he did the thing he had learned to do. He smoothed his face, made his shoulders wider than they felt, and said, the way fathers say things to steady children, "We'll find out. We'll do everything we can." They were 12 in the waiting room together, 2 chairs and a worn coffee table. Other people sat breathing their own slow human anxieties. A man with a newborn who had eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, an older woman with a knitted shawl, a teenager with a backpack and a face like a closed door. The clock ticked. A PA system announced names intermittently in a voice that didn't know how to be gentle. At the check-in desk, the clerk's name tag said, "Hale." He wore his neat hair like a shield and had a voice that landed like a ledger. He slid forms from a stack, the paper whispering like the inside of a safe. "Insurance?" he asked, fingers already on a keyboard. "Policy number?" Tom, that was the name he still used sometimes, though some people called him Mark and other people called him Dad, fumbled in a folder. He had spent the last morning rifling through paperwork at the kitchen table, doing math like a private, quiet sadness. There were notes in his handwriting, pharmacy dates, phone numbers, the practical grammar of keeping a small life together. "Dependent?" Hale asked, as if reciting from an instruction manual. He did not look up, and his tone made it clear his attention was a commodity he did not plan to squander. "She's my daughter," Tom said. "Maya. She—" He stopped, because what came next was heavy and useless. The details of payments, the collapsed breath of nights without sleep. He breathed out and shoved the papers toward Hale. Hale ran his eyes down the forms. "Coverage doesn't fully apply for outpatient consults in this tier unless pre-authorization is completed. I can help you with a referral for financial counseling, or we can schedule within our charity program, which has a waiting list." Tom's fingers tightened around the drawing in his daughter's hand. The word "waiting" folded itself around them like another fluorescent strip. He opened his mouth to explain 100 things, that they had no time, that the waiting list had already swallowed months, but he could not find the right words that would matter. The bureaucratic phrasing seemed designed to make compassion optional. Every polite, efficient phrase was a small, soft dismissal. Beside them, a nurse passed with a clipboard, eyes down, the practiced gait of someone who had learned to carry other people's urgent things in a way that made them lighter. She offered a soft look to Maya, a glance that said, without words, "I see you." And Tom felt something like air move across bruised places inside him. The nurse's name badge read Rosa. Her smile was quick but honest, a small instrument of human salvage. Maya, sensing the way his jaw had clenched, slid her small hand into his and squeezed. "It's okay, Daddy," she said, in the voice of children who are old before their years. "We're brave." If there was a promise he could not make, she made it for them both. He let a short laugh escape. It was brittle at first, then softening. The laugh did him like a first breath after a long dive. If you believe dignity shouldn't depend on money, consider subscribing. The world could use reminders of that. They were called next, not by the soft voice of the PA system, but by an intercom buzz that said it was their turn. The room they were taken to had a window that looked onto a courtyard where a single tree had already gone pale with the season. The private consult felt like a small reprieve, softer light, a chair that did not squeak. He read too many faces into every doorway. He watched how the consult's assistant filed forms and balanced paperwork like armor. Tom had been in too many rooms like this in the last months. Rooms that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and possibility. Rooms where decisions were made about other people's lives in tones that slid easily between compassionate and procedural. Then the door opened, and a man entered with the kind of absence of hurry that announces power without needing to wear it. He was neither young nor garrulous. He had the kind of plain clothes that said he did not need them to shout his place in the world. His name badge said Dr. Victor Lane, head of Pediatrics. He carried himself as someone who had learned to weigh small things carefully. He had a way of seeing that made the space feel smaller and kinder at once, as if the room itself bent to accommodate whatever truth needed saying. Victor's eyes found Maya's. He tilted his head slightly, a quiet question forming. He sat and, to Tom's surprise, did not begin with charts or questions. He asked a simple, practical thing instead. "How are you two today?" Tom's answer was the economy of someone trained in protective half-truths. "We're okay," he said. We want to know what's next." Victor listened. When he spoke, he had a voice that did not hurry to judgment. He asked about their day, about how long Maya had been visiting the clinic. He asked about the drawing she clutched. A scribbled sun, a house, a person with a proud, crooked smile. Maya explained in small phrases. She offered the drawing to Victor like a gift. He accepted it, as if accepting an offering, and set it carefully on his desk between them. Victor rose after a while and walked into the hall. He did not ask permission. He did not need to. He walked straight to Hale at the desk and did something the hospital bureaucracies were rarely built to absorb. He spoke with a soft, clear firmness. He asked to see their file. He asked if any immediate financial barriers could be eased for a case that looked fragile. He asked, and his voice carried the kind of authority that turned memos into actions. Hale's posture shifted. There was a small moment where officialdom and human need touched like two plates sliding past one another. Hale reached for his keyboard, his fingers moving. He printed forms, checked boxes, and murmured to his assistant about reallocating resources. It was administrative motion, and yet it changed the atmosphere by degrees that mattered. Victor returned and closed the door gently, like a person not wanting to announce a miracle, but determined to remove humiliation. He sat. "I can fast-track this," he said to Tom. "We'll see her now. and we'll organize counseling about costs, immediate help for things you need." Tom breathed. The sentence was simple and ordinary. It contained the radical thing people usually expect from porch lights and open doors. It treated them like people. Tom's throat tightened. He had been expecting to bargain with a machine. He had been expecting to prove worth. He hadn't been expecting dignified ease. Victor's gaze landed on the pendant around Maya's neck. He asked, "Brave?" Maya's reply was immediate and proud. "My mom said it." She smiled a little, remembering. The name that rose in the room like the scent of baking was the name Tom had tucked away. Her mother's picture lived in the back pocket of his wallet, a small square of someone laughing with new teeth, someone not yet tired by hospital corridors. Victor considered the picture. For a breath, he looked old in the way people look when memory is something that can be called and summoned without warning. Then he did something quiet that would change the whole tenor of the day. He told a short story. He did not begin with his office or a resume of accomplishments. He spoke as if pulling a thread from his own childhood. "When I was 6, my mother took me to a clinic," Victor said. His voice lowered in a way that made the room feel private. "We were poor then. I remember the waiting room. Plastic chairs, the same hum of lights, the smell of disinfectant. My mother kept her head down. She had paper bags from the market clutched under her arm. When it was our turn, the woman at the desk asked a question about our insurance. My mother explained she didn't have coverage beyond a small municipal plan, and the woman, she said something like, 'There are protocols, and we can try next week.'" He paused and touched the corner of Maya's drawing, as if returning the child's gift to its rightful place. There was a small sheen at the corner of his eye, more memory than tears. "My mother held me tight. She told me to be brave. I promised myself then I would not be the kind of place that sent people home because they didn't fit a line item in a budget." Tom felt the ground beneath his belief shift. The story landed like a blunt instrument on a lock he'd kept fastened. The man in front of him had a power over systems, and the story explained why he chose to use it softly, suddenly. Tom's chest loosened in a way he hadn't expected. The sound he made was something between a sob and a laugh. He felt strangely exposed, the way a window shows you your reflection when you least expect it. The bitterness he had carried toward institutions did not dissipate, but the presence in the room offered him something nobody had offered in months: human recognition. Victor reached across the table and placed his hand, an adult hand that had once been a child's burned on memory, on Tom's folded hands. "I can't promise the future," Victor said, with a realism Tom had been starved for. "I can promise we will do everything we can to make sure you are treated with respect, to make sure no one turns you away with an honest explanation and an offered solution." There was a pause that felt like a hinge swinging open. Tom's tears came then, reluctant, surprised, but real. He let them fall because they belonged somewhere, and because this man had given permission with his steadied voice. Victor's actions were practical and immediate. He instructed Hale, not in a manner meant to shame, but in one that rearranged priorities. He requested a social worker be assigned that day, and a financial counselor would meet them after their consult to go through options, not as pity, but as aid. He spoke to the charge nurse about reassigning staff to ensure that the consult would be thorough and not hurried. He made a note in his own handwriting to review how families without robust insurance were triaged and referred. He used words like policy and fund and initiative, legal administrative nouns that, translated, meant a fast-tracked consult and help with bills for now. He spoke, in quiet, to the idea that dignity should be part of triage. The dismissive administrator, Hale, was not flung like a villain from a soap opera. Instead, he was invited into a meeting where his limitations were named and his options considered. There was accountability, but it was the kind of accountability that did not humiliate further. It corrected the system's blind spots. There might be disciplinary steps later. There would be training modules. There would be a human resources conversation about how front desk interactions shape outcomes. Those would take time. They would not be performative. But Victor's immediate priorities were clear. Get the child the care needed that day without the family being forced into a spectacle of pleading. After the consult, a nurse, Rosa, brought Maya a small store-bought cupcake with a paper flag that said "Brave." The gesture was tiny, and it changed everything. Maya's face lit up as if the world had handed her permission to be a child in a place that had been asking so much of her to hold up. She offered the cupcake to Tom with that solemn, practical generosity children have. He took a bite and laughed at the sweet that was bad store frosting but tasted like kindness. Victor knelt at Maya's eye level as she handed him her drawing. He accepted it with reverence. He read her crooked sun and squiggly house like a vow. "Thank you," he said. "Your drawing is brave." That afternoon, Victor wrote a memo. He wrote it in a way that converted compassion into policy. A short-term fund for immediate patient needs, a streamlined pathway for urgent consults for children whose families might not navigate the bureaucracy quickly, and a training program for front desk staff to recognize when a family's need required not a script, but a conversation. He underlined one phrase: dignity as a standard of care. He emailed copies to the hospital administrator, to social work, to finance. He included an offer, not as charity, but as structural remediation, that the hospital would seed the new fund and that he himself would find donors among networks he had not yet used this way. Victor knelt at Maya's eye level as she handed him her drawing. He accepted it with reverence. He read her crooked sun and squiggly house like a vow. "Thank you," he said. "Your drawing is brave." That afternoon, Victor wrote a memo. He wrote it in a way that converted compassion into policy. A short-term fund for immediate patient needs, a streamlined pathway for urgent consults for children whose families might not navigate the bureaucracy quickly, and a training program for front desk staff to recognize when a family's need required not a script, but a conversation. He underlined one phrase: dignity as a standard of care. He emailed copies to the hospital administrator, to social work, to finance. He included an offer, not as charity, but as structural remediation, that the hospital would seed the new fund and that he himself would find donors among networks he had not yet used this way. Tom listened to the language like someone who hears a new vocabulary for a thing he had always felt. It was not a cure, and it was not a promise that everything would be fixed. It was the translation of pain into deliberate motion. Later, when Victor walked them to the parking lot and handed Tom a card, he did a small thing that felt extraordinary. He wrote across the back, in his steady print, a personal number. "If anything goes wrong," he said, "call me." Tom could have said it was against protocol. He could have let that line of propriety stand. Instead, he clutched the card like a talisman. He did not know what to expect in the weeks that followed, but he had a new instrument, a man who could pull strings within a system for the sake of a child's dignity. The weight of that felt less like charity and more like an unlocked door. Weeks later, a modest program began. They called it the Brave Ribbon Initiative, a name suggested by the nurse Rosa, who liked symbols. It was small at first: office hours for family assistance, a fund to cover urgent co-pays and transportation, staff training modules about compassionate triage, and a support group that met Tuesday evenings where parents could share practical things without the glare of pity. Victor hosted the first meeting, standing at the back like someone who had learned that leadership could mean listening. The program rolled out quietly. There were sign-up forms and an orientation. There were charts. There were people who joined because they had been moved to act by the push of a single day. Donors wrote checks with the kinds of notes people gave, in memory, in honor, or because their childhoods had taught them fear. A local business donated care packages for families waiting in long clinics. A group of volunteers knit small home comforts to be handed to visiting children. It did not fix every problem. It could not, and no one promised it would. But the difference was visible enough to be counted. Shorter waits, families who felt seen, less time spent on scripts, and more on listening. Tom watched the shift like a person who had been allowed to lean his head against the hard shoulder of something steady. He began to breathe. He started sleeping in patches that came to feel like nights again. He took to walking Maya to the little park across from their apartment on afternoons when the light lowered and seemed to offer apologies. They fed ducks with crusts of bread, and sometimes on the bench, Tom would watch his daughter play, and he would think of the pendant, the drawing, the thin, brave line that stitched them together. There were follow-up visits, too. Medical uncertainty lingered like a low hum. Doctors, not the head of Pediatrics, but a team of people who carried the weight of clinical complexity, spoke in measured terms about options, about monitoring, about the need for time and attention. Tom listened. He learned to ask questions that cut through jargon. He learned to say, simply, "Can you explain that in a way she can understand?" He watched how staff began to shift their language. People who once felt defensive grew cautious of a new standard. There were meetings where Hale, the administrator who had been the face of procedural distance, was present and quiet, ears open. He accepted coaching. He apologized to Tom in a way that felt real, not dramatic, not performative, but straightforward. "We handled that poorly," he said. "We're changing how we train." Actions followed words, new scripts, new triage steps. It was corrective rather than punitive, which made it stick. Months later, there was an open day at the hospital for the Brave Ribbon Initiative. Families who had been helped were there, scattered like soft testimonies. Volunteers set up a small table with decorated ribbons and cookies. Maya, who had learned to carry hope with small practicality, stood beside a banner that read in simple letters, "Brave Ribbon, support for families in need." She clipped a paper ribbon onto a string with the same concentration a child gives to tying shoes. She waved a little to Victor, who watched from the doorway with a hand resting on a clipboard. He was no longer only the man with a card. He had become a figure who scheduled his compassion into the hours of his days. One of the volunteers at the table was a woman named Lena, who had been a single mother receiving help the previous winter. She spoke to Tom and then, with the immediate generosity the newly supported sometimes have, asked whether he would consider joining a mentor group once he felt ready. "You've been through it," she said. "You'll know what they need." Tom nodded. He was still wary of anything that felt like being carried. But the way the hospital had moved in his daughter's name made him feel, for the first time in a long while, entitled to accept kindness. The biggest change, perhaps, came not from memos or funds, but from the small rituals that human beings share. At a staff meeting, a young receptionist read aloud a note they had received from a father whose child had been helped through the initiative. The note was simple. "Thank you for making us feel like people." The room was quiet. Victor watched the faces of his staff. He watched the way the human voice had been returned to the center of their work. He allowed himself a small, private satisfaction at the shift. There were hard days after that. The medical horizon remained uncharted, with its indefinidos and monitoring appointments. There were nights Tom sat on the kitchen floor and sorted pills into days and nights like a person building a fragile structure. There were times Maya asked, with that same hush, "Am I getting worse?" And Tom found himself answering differently. He did not claim certainty. He did not pretend the unknown had an easy map. But he found a new language, one that admitted fear and then supplied presents. "No," he would say sometimes. "You're not alone. That's what we can promise." Other times, he would hold her and admit he didn't know. The key was what came after the admission. He would act. He would call the hospital. He would ask questions. He would sit with her through the waiting. He would let the brave pendant rest against his chest when she slept. One afternoon in late autumn, the three of them met at a small park bench where the light turned the city into slow gold. Victor had arranged a visit that was not clinical. No charts, no staff, just a man who had promised a tiny measure of his time. He brought with him a paper cup of coffee and a folded piece of paper, the first annual report from the Brave Ribbon Initiative. It was modest, printed on inexpensive stock, but inside were small numbers that meant things people treated as impossible. Families helped, dollars distributed for urgent bills, staff trained in compassionate triage. The report did not read like a press release. It read like an accounting of human salvage. Victor handed a copy to Tom. "We still have a long way to go," he said, "but we are listening." Maya, who had grown used to these new adult rhythms, handed Victor a new drawing she had made. This one had more detail. 2 figures holding hands, a tree, and a small hospital in the background with a bright sun overhead. "This is for you," she said, solemn and precise, "because you helped." Victor took the drawing and, without being staged, he knelt. The man who had been a child in a harsh waiting room matched her level. He did not pat her head or offer a wordless smile. He looked at her like someone meeting a serious colleague in a small fight for human dignity. "Thank you," he said. "You're very brave." Tom watched the exchange and felt an odd, bright thing inside him. Relief, yes, but also a softening. The kind that means you can lean on someone and they will not collapse under the weight. He had been changed by the realization that there were people in positions of power who used them to stitch the world together again, who wrote memos but also knelt before a child's drawing. He cried then, quietly, with his face turned to the park. It was not a break so much as the breaking open of something that had been set tight for survival. On the walk home that day, Maya asked, again like someone testing a new shore, "Daddy, am I getting worse?" Tom stopped, and instead of looking anywhere but at her, he said plainly, "I don't know if things will change quickly. I don't know every answer. But I do know this. We have people who will stand with us now. We won't have to plead alone. We will keep doing everything we can." Maya thought about that with the deliberation of a child who is learning about time. "Okay," she said at last. "That sounds like brave." Months turned into a pattern. The Brave Ribbon Initiative grew in the way that small, focused things grow, slowly, with the patient turning of attention. A small grant arrived from a community foundation to help with transportation vouchers. A local bakery partnered to donate snacks for families spending long hours in consults. A retired nurse ran a weekly support group for parents. The hospital's front desk scripts were replaced by training modules that taught staff a different first question. "How can I help you feel more comfortable today?" instead of "What's your insurance?" The change did not erase bureaucracy. It reoriented its first principle toward human recognition. Tom found himself in a place he had not planned to live, participating. He volunteered, at first awkwardly, to sit on a parent advisory panel. He offered a practical thing, hours he could keep, a willingness to speak if necessary, an ability to listen to other parents who were exhausted. Lena, the single mother, became his friend. They met at the park. They traded recipes and tips for dealing with nights when the monitors were loud. They shared the small humor of life that insists on existing around tragedy. A picture of a cat in a ridiculous costume. A joke about a doctor who always misplaces his pen. Those were the real stitches. They held things together. There were days when the old shame crept at the edges, when bills stacked, when a medication ran short because a refill was delayed, when a staff member in some other wing treated them like a line item. Those days required the tools Victor had helped create: a phone call, a referral, a friendly face from social work who would not let their case slip between cracks. It was not a blanket solution. It was the architecture of small interventions that, together, made life survivable. One winter evening, Tom found himself staring at the small pendant on Maya's chest as snow began to soften the city. He thought about the other children he had met in the clinic: a boy who loved dinosaurs and had the bravest laugh, a girl who carried a stuffed bear with a missing button eye, and he realized, with a clarity that surprised him, that dignity was contagious. When you saw people as people, they learned to be people again. The epilogue of their story was not a headline. It did not end in a single grand reveal where everything became easy. It was quieter, stitched through with the small augmentations of life. There was, however, a defining moment that felt like a full circle and one that would sit in his memory. A year after that first hall conversation, the hospital held a small ceremony in the atrium. The Brave Ribbon Initiative celebrated its first anniversary. Staff, volunteers, families, and a handful of donors gathered around a modest table holding cookies and punched paper ribbons. Maya stood near Tom in a plain dress that had once been too big for her. She had a charm of newness in her manner now, the kind that comes when a child spends a lot of time with adults who tell them the truth and follow it with action. Victor gave a short speech. He did not stand with a podium that separated him from the people in the room. Instead, he faced them as one human to others. He spoke about policies and numbers, certainly. He also spoke about a small boy long ago who had been held by a mother and taught to be brave. He said that the work was not finished and that dignity could not be scheduled into a memo alone. He asked for continued attention and for the community to remember that every family's story mattered. Tom felt his throat tighten listening to the way Victor framed it. At the end of the speech, Victor called Maya forward and asked if she would cut the cake, a small ceremonial gesture. She hesitated, then accepted, because children, when invited into adult symbols, often perform them with an earnestness adults have lost. She cut the cake. Victor reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to Tom with the matter-of-fact air of someone dealing in practicalities. Inside was a note, a small scholarship established by the Brave Ribbon Initiative for families who needed help with unexpected medical expenses. It was not the kind of rescue that solved everything, but it was a lifeline, something that could keep a night lit when darkness came. Tom accepted it without a word. He felt things like a tide, gratitude, relief, a small terror at being allowed to receive. He looked at Victor then, really looked, and he saw not a savior, but a man who had taken the memory of his own small humiliation and chosen to bend his influence toward making sure others did not feel the same. The notion of power used for repair, not spectacle, was almost unfamiliar, and it sank into him with a slow richness. After the ceremony, as people milled and laughed and took photos in a corner of the atrium, Maya wandered off to find a window. She placed her hand lightly against the glass and watched the afternoon fold. Tom sat beside her and put an arm around her shoulders, feeling the steady, small heartbeat under his palm. She looked up at him. "Daddy?" He smiled and waited, because sometimes the patience to listen was itself an answer. "Am I getting worse?" she asked, the question returning like a tide that wants ashore. There was no panic in it now, rather an old, weary curiosity made new. The question had become, in a way, an offering, a demand for an honest companion rather than a miracle. Tom took a breath. His answer was not a promise about the future. It was not a certainty that stitched time into neat boxes. It was the deep, human clarity he had learned from the men and women who had acted when it mattered. "You're brave," he said, and this time the word landed like an anchor. We'll keep fighting, together. We'll ask for help when we need it. We'll make sure people treat you like a person, not a list. That I promise." She leaned into him, as if that small set of promises were things that could be folded and placed in her pocket. Victor stood in the background, watching with the kind of quiet contentment a person feels when a set of small, stubborn pieces finally come together. He had not rescued them from uncertainty. He had chosen to step into the gap and make the path smoother. Tom watched him and felt, for a long beat, like someone who had received a reprieve, not bought with money, but earned through the steady action of an ally. The final image was simple. The three of them under a tree in a fading afternoon, the light sifting through the branches. Maya's pendant caught a sliver of sun and flashed. Tom's hand found hers and squeezed. Victor stood a safe space away, not intruding, only present. There was no neat cinematic cure. There was rather a human architecture, a hospital that had learned to listen, a program that would reach other families, a father who had been allowed, finally, to be human, and a child who learned how to be brave without being alone. If this story moved you, if you believe that dignity should not depend on the size of a wallet or the thickness of a file, consider subscribing and sharing this message. Small actions ripple into systems. Small acts of care change lives. They walked away together then, not hurried. The city folded around them like a familiar blanket. Maya hummed a little tune. Tom let the sound fill him. He did not know every horizon, but he knew the next thing. He would be there with her. He would keep asking. He would keep making sure someone answered back with the language of respect. And somewhere, someone else would hear a similar question in a sterile waiting room and, because people had chosen to act, receive an answer that treated them like a person.